First of all, let me give a shout out to everybody who's made this possible. Tara, and this wouldn't have happened without her active participation in making this one to happen. And she really has become what I would think representative of the Pikes Peak Library District. Why? Because I presented over at Rock Rimmon at the community library there, and it wouldn't have happened without the library staff there and without the larger support. I'm referring to Brian Matthews, who did the flyers and for both Rock Rimmon and for here. This wouldn't have happened. And it's really touching to know that as a debut author, that you can touch people here within the community who are willing, cost-free, to promote your efforts. And that's very warming. That's a very warming thought. And so I'm very appreciative, and I give that shout out. Not a paid political announcement. And willingly, much willingly, and I'm very grateful for that kind of support. Okay, why historical fiction? The novel is historical fiction. And there's I'm going to go into a little bit about the various genres as a debut author. I was always very entranced with Clancy, and that genre, the techno thriller, if you will, and Steve Kuntz and the others of that period, that era. But I was concerned because once, way back when, I was in uniform and working as an analyst, because when you're not in country, you're an analyst. That people were of our generation, Ed, like our generation, everybody knows about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah, 1962. Serious time, no doubt about it. But guess what? There was also another time, and thanks to a CIA historian, now retired, by the name of Benjamin Fisher, good man, he wrote a monograph that put several points together, because as a historian, he was a CIA historian, you don't look at individual events in themselves, you look for trends, streams of thinking. And once you start seeing the larger picture, don't focus on the micro, but on the macro picture of an entire country, how their military, political leadership thinks. Okay, that's what the American people paid me for, was what do the Russians, what do the Soviets, how do they think, what do they think? Because as an intelligence officer, you're required for three things. Your analysis has to be timely, it has to be accurate, and oh, by the way, predictive, because that's what the American people are paying you for. Predictive. The people who are making decisions want to know not just what's going on, and that's what this is about. It's why it went on, why it happened. Not so much what, but why it happened. Okay? Now, when you get into the why, you get more into how people think, into characters and so forth. 1983, the novel, is based on historical fact. There is the historical side of the fiction side. It's all based on fact. Okay? There were 7 readers of the manuscript, 2 who had PhDs, and both of them were attributed to the accuracy of the events that are depicted here. So, the fiction is a number of the characters. You'll recognize names, real names, real people, and but there are some fictional characters in there. They exemplify thinking, a way of thinking, either American or Soviet. Okay, so then now that gets it into the advantage of historical fiction. Okay, why historical fiction? It does promise, an entry, and it is entry level path that is richer and more textured than just straightforward history. Okay? Again, straightforward history is good in and in itself, fine, fine. But what it doesn't do, it doesn't get into why events occurred. It tells you what occurred, but not necessarily why it occurred. Okay? Now, what does stick to the facts, and at least it can at least preface speculation. Okay? That's about as far as it can go. Well, maybe, possibly, likely, so forth. Now, and perhaps, with the advantages of historical fiction, 1983, is not going to end up in just another research institute or academic library or academic institute. What had happened was people who did not know about 1983, the threat, the danger that both countries were in. In 62, okay, we saw both countries were approaching Armageddon. We know that, okay? History shows that we saw daylight, thank goodness for that. Now, what nobody knew about 1983 is that two actors, US, USSR, again, were approaching a confrontational state, which one of the actors, Soviet Union, believed the worst was about to happen. US did not know that, it was not aware of it. So unlike Cuba, where both parties understood, okay, what a miscalculation could do, right? In 1983, only one party knew. So there are a number of reasons for that. Okay, that's what it can do. And that's what the information I wanted to project and portray was to get it out to a broader audience that would have more appeal, okay? To have more appeal, not just a stultified, tome against the bookcase again in a research institute, but a broader audience. You can reach a broader audience of people who would be interested in this, about what didn't happen, could have happened, but didn't happen, but to a broader audience, and not just enrich their information, but provide a portrayal of actual events. Okay. Like I said, the 62 crisis, it could, but also to inform. 1983 is based on and inspired by actual historical events. Now, historical fiction does present a gratifying sense of immersion. I love that word, immersion. I love immersion. Immersion is what in historical fiction is the bread and butter. Okay? Now I use a reference to a Roman emperor. Immersion will tell you what it's like in the Colosseum, what it smells like, what it feels like in there, the temperature, the crowds, and so forth, and what is expected, the dirtiness, the sweat. That's immersion. When you can put and pull the reader into that milieu, you've done good. You've done good. Well, in 1983, okay, based on my experiences, I'm going to take you in what it's like as an American agent by the name of Jim Morrell. All these names, by the way, and I'm going to give you some trivia. It's like in Moscow in December 1981 on his way to meet an agent. That is a defector. Okay? He happens to be a general officer serving in the KGB in charge of personnel, which would be the jewel. Langley CIA would love to have that kind of information. Okay? Now, it's cold, he's wet, he hurts because he just delayed, he spent 12 hours getting what he called before going black. What it is to be actually tracked by the KGB, the second chief directorate responsible for internal country security, okay? And they are large. I can tell you at any one time, the number of KGB that tracked the American embassy and its personnel in Moscow was at least 5,000. 5,000, okay? Now, I had mentioned to Ed earlier that thank goodness that there are two major documents that were recently declassified. One was the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. It was headed by Bobby Gates, former SecDef, former CIA, okay? And I used a lot of that information that has finally been declassified. The second thing is I used a book that has come out, thank goodness, and it's on Moscow. It was called, Moscow Rules. Moscow Rules is a handy little book, and what it is that when we went in country, okay, you knew what you were supposed to do, you knew how you were going to go about doing it, and so forth, but there were also little things that you learned that were passed down from one agent to another. For example, when was the best time to meet your agent? It was at night, okay? But where? Where? Okay? Now, that's a thing that you'd be looking for. Okay, I can give you one. The KGB, for example, when they would track on trail, okay? They would change clothes, okay? That's understandable, all right? They'd never look you in the eye. When you pass them on the street, they would pass you. There's usually an agent, a KGB agent in front of you, and maybe one or two in the back, okay? Now, how do you get rid of that tail? How do you recognize a tail when you see it, all right? One thing about the KGB is, yes, they would change clothes, but they wouldn't change their shoes. So you could identify the agent again and again by the same pair of shoes that he was wearing. He'd be wearing different clothes, but he wouldn't change his shoes. Things like that, okay? Or things that were necessarily out of place. A planter out in the middle of nowhere, just there. Well, that was a marker. It was a marker for them to know how far distance-wise you were walking and how fast you were walking, so they could track it. Little things like that, and that's in here. Okay. Now, that's all part of that immersion. Okay. I want you to feel that. I want you to feel the cold. I want you to feel what it's like to be tracked and traced. Okay. And people shooting at you. Okay. All right. The inner thinking. Okay. It, like I said, this is less about the what than it is about the why. It's a book about the why. Now, that is, the characters, may not be like us, the Soviets, in this case, the Soviets, or any historical fiction book for that matter. Then, I don't want them to be like us. If then your thinking is wrong. You have not got into their habits of thinking, you don't know their culture, you don't know their history, the things that impact the way they think, not only as individuals, but as a country. Okay, there's two countries in the world. This is a question for you guys. What two countries in the world were both attacked? Surprise attack.
When?
Anytime.
Ever?
Yeah. Well, recent, let's say 20th century.
The United States and the Soviet Union?
That's it. Thank you. It's not a shield, that's not paid. It's true. June 22nd, Barbarossa, Soviet Union was attacked. And you know how many people died?
20-something million?
Yeah, 28.8. It only came out because Gorbachev in 1990 released it. That number had been classified up until then, until 1990. 28,800,000. Okay, 8 million were military, 20 million were civilian. Okay, and as you pointed out, the other country was the United States. December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Okay, so both countries in our history, in our mantra, if you will, never again will we allow ourselves to be attacked as a surprise. Okay, never again. In the Soviet Union, that is particularly burned into their social consciousness. There wasn't one family in that country, 11 time zone, largest country on the planet, that wasn't affected by the war. Not one. Okay? They remember. So does the party, so does the people. Okay? Something like that you keep in the back of your brain. This influences the way they think, it's the way they see adversaries, okay? And how they determine threats. There's no nice threats, okay? Usually their thinking comes around very conservatively, okay? And they'll see threats perhaps where there aren't any, but for them, why take a chance? They took a chance in 1941, don't do it again. Now, actually, it can also have another more concealed purpose. This is one I really like. To comment on the present by the way of the past, a sci-fi interprets the present by imagining the future. The writer, you are as a writer, if you're going to engage in historical fiction, you've got a means or a vehicle, a great vehicle, to interject controversy, for example, by way of analogies, or accenting certain cultural positive or negative mores by way of the dialogue of certain characters. You can do that, okay? Now, does it mean that you have an opinion? Certainly it means you have an opinion, and you can interject it. You can interject it into the fictional characters that you would, what they would normally say in that situation, okay? Now, how do they respond to their country's mores? For example, the Soviet Union was extremely conformist, it was communist, you know, but there were a number of subjects that were absolutely taboo. Number one of which was crime. It didn't exist. Why would there be crime in a worker's paradise? Why would there be murder in a worker's paradise? Theft, things of that nature, alcoholism, the poor state of the health, and so forth that they were supposed to be having. All that, but you can touch on that. You can touch on that by the way the characters react to certain circumstances. For example, there's a lady who works for Soviet military intelligence. Her name is Masha. Okay, her husband was a drunkard. That was not uncommon at all. And she would have divorced him, but she couldn't afford to, because where would she live? Where would she live? Thank God she didn't have any children. He probably froze to death on a bench in Moscow during a sub-zero weather. You know, that alcoholism was rampant, but you didn't talk about it. I can talk about it, you know, and I brought it up. Historical fiction offers a way of writing between the lines, you bet. Tentative reader, okay, notice this parallel. You can do this. As an author, you can do this. You can interject and put little silent gestures toward the tyranny, the absurdity of the moment of writing. As Santana said, history does repeat itself, okay? But you can focus on things as an author within that country's milieu, as long as it's accurate, okay? You can focus on that people might not otherwise pay attention to. By way of nuances, phraseology, not so much, but what it is understated. In other words, some things that aren't said, okay? Remember those taboos I referenced, so forth, okay? You can see things as an author. You can interject visions of things that your character is seeing, but he can't report them, okay? But you can, okay? The dialogue is a wonderful decisive deliverer for this type of expression, questioning or accepting that what is reasonable in that milieu, okay? And this applies to, I'm not going to get over too much on the Russia side, excuse me, but on the American side too. There was a way of thinking. In 1980, with Reagan coming into power, after Jimmy Carter was lambasted on the political platform as having been weak, okay, and allowed the country to promote a missile gap with the Soviet Union, okay? Remember Kennedy with the, what was it? It was a bomber gap. Well, with Reagan, it was a missile gap, all of which were overblown for reasons of political expediency. Got him elected. Okay, now, I take you into the boardroom of the National Security Council and what the order of the day was, okay? Without a paper trail, the NSC came down from the National Security Advisor, you know, and verbally from Reagan, okay? We were going to show the Russians who's who. We were, because Carter was weak and was taken advantage of, according to the way of thinking. I'll take you into what it was like, how Reagan responded without a paper trail. The American people were not supposed to know about this. Two of them. One, we actually put a fleet, NATO fleet, USS Eisenhower and the British carrier, I'm thinking, Repulse, was ordered into the North Atlantic. They actually flew sorties against the Soviet Union. Yeah, off the carriers. What they would do is they would attack, virtually simulate an attack on the Russian mainland, and then at the last moment back off. The idea was to bring up their radars and so forth, and actually scare the devil out of them, because they don't know what's going on. They hadn't seen this type of behavior before. A portion of the Navy actually went up, if you can think of the Kola Peninsula, right down in here. Remember Red October talks about Polygotomy? That's the boomer base, SSBN, or the Soviet missile submarine base. Okay, that would be like Charleston or Puget Sound. That's where we keep our boomers. Well, that's where they keep their Northern Fleet boomers, is up on the Army, up on the Kola Peninsula. Okay, we put 3 ships up there, went MCOM. In other words, no communications. Okay, they went silent, totally silent. And what they did was they sat there for 3 days. Very sensitive area, as you might expect. Very sensitive. Because boomers are retaliatory. They're part of your deterrent. Okay? They were how you would fight a war. Okay? So they're very sensitive. At the last second, it turned everything on. Well, the Soviets couldn't believe it that the Americans could get, and the British could get in so close to such a sensitive base. What happened was, and something that was going to become very serious, and it's something that's part of the Russian milieu, they're thinking, what exposed was vulnerability. Okay? Well, we may not think so much of it, but in the Soviet Union, that kind of thinking, the vulnerability is extremely dangerous. You do not allow it under any circumstances. Okay? The reason being, capitalism, socialism. Okay? By virtue of capitalism, we are the enemy. Okay? That's just the way it is. Okay? Ever since the October Revolution, 1917. Okay? We are the enemy. What you never do as a socialist country is show vulnerability. Why? Because the enemy, us, the main enemy, we're still referred to, by the way, currently, by Putin and ever since him, as the main enemy. We've always been the main enemy, the United States. Okay? They will take advantage of that vulnerability and exploit it. Because why? Vulnerability is a weakness that the capitalists will exploit. Okay? So that it is absolutely forbidden to show any kind of vulnerability. Well, they showed just how vulnerable they were to a sneak attack. And that's how they considered it. Remember we get into the Soviet mindset, way they think, so forth? What this did, it showed that the United States was capable of sneak attack. Okay? And they would have been caught with their britches down. Okay? They were vulnerable to a U.S. sneak attack. Okay? That began to circulate around in Moscow among the political and of the security and the military security people. We have just let the Americans know how vulnerable we are to a sneak attack. Again, 1941 all over again. Okay. Now, next slide, please. Now, I've talked to you about some of the advantages of a debut author when he goes into historical fiction. The advantages, well, there are also challenges. Okay, they're not disadvantages, but there's something you have to take into consideration if you're going to use that genre of historical fiction. The history versus the story. The balance of too little history or not enough. Too much, it'll read like a history book, which you don't want, and too little, it won't even immerse the reader in the subject. Okay, and that's the advantage that you have. There's immersion. You can put the reader in actual historical circumstances. Okay, now, how much history do you put in there? Okay, well, you can't lie. Okay, if it's going to be a historical fiction, if 50% of the book is going to be based on history, don't change it if it makes the facts let the facts drive the story, okay? So, one thing, they talk about the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? No, I would amend that. Reading, writing, and research, okay? Research. And I can't really, if you're going to impress the reader and immerse that reader where they feel confident that what they're reading about is not only enjoyable, but informative, okay? It's got to be accurate, okay? And your research has to show that. Now, that's an awful lot of research. Yes, it is. But, and you know what you're not gonna use? About 90% of it you're not gonna use. You won't be using it, because that will put you too much into the historical realm, all right? What you want is about 5 to 10%, okay, of that, and it adds background. And that's what I use the historical facts for, as background, okay? They were driving the characters, rather than the characters driving the drama, okay? Now, as a deep understanding of the period, there's no secondary thinking about that. You have to be, whether it's a Roman Colosseum in 50 AD or in the back streets of Moscow in 1982, all right? Or in a boardroom across from the White House at a National Security Conference meeting, okay? You've got to place the reader there, and it's got to be accurate. Now, the advantage I had is because I've been there, okay? Book was easy in the sense that I was there, I've seen it, you know? I know what the banisters look like, and I know what trash bins in the backyard of a Moscow tenement building looks like, okay? Now, whether and how far to bend it through. Some historical fiction writers, nothing provokes more anxiety than the weather and how far to bend it through. Well, you don't. If you're going to bend it, you need to tell the writer, or the reader, okay? Now, there's one case in here, and I do mention it, there's one case where Admiral Harriman visited Moscow in 1983, and I moved the date up a couple weeks. It didn't change anything, it still happened, and it still had the same reactions, okay? Still, I noted, okay? That was it. That was my only change. Now, as it says here, there are as many opinions on this as there are historical novelists. And in a sense, yep, there really is no right answer about that. It's going to be required that the more you have, the more you change, the more likely you're going to get a backlash from the author and others, okay? In other words, somebody's going to review, somebody's going to say something somewhere that, you know, that, well, you can't really rely on the historical accuracy of the work, okay? If changes to the historical record, make sure you have a good reason. Yes, yeah, okay? And at the end of the novel, a historical note, as well as flesh out more of the background behind your story, okay? In other words, I'm going to show you. Here is, okay. Epilogue. I include an epilogue. In other words, what happened to the characters after 1983. Okay? That's to keep the historical drama as such, because it is accurate. These people that I do depict in there are real people. Okay? And there are others as well. For example, here, this is what drove a lot of Soviet fear. These two weapon systems right here, the Pershing II and the cruise missiles. And I'll get into it and tell you, you don't need to be a scientist to figure it out. I kept it simple. But fear, remember I was telling you about the fear aspect in Soviet mentality thinking and worst case analysis about threat? They couldn't stop those. They couldn't stop the Pershing II. It could be 6-minute launch from West Germany, and they could hit Moscow within 8 minutes. The Russians couldn't stop it, and they couldn't recognize it until it was too late. Okay? With the cruise missiles, couldn't shoot them down. They didn't have look down, shoot down radar for the MiG-23s. Okay? In other words, from any target, at any altitude, and at any azimuth, we could hit the Soviet Union and they could not do anything about it. Okay? Now, if that doesn't stoke your paranoia, nothing will. Okay? Now, next please. Okay, authentic language. Now, I was talking about immersion. Now, if you're going to do a foreign country, it does behoove you to know the language. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean you're going to have to go to school and take, classes and classes and classes of language. Okay? Because you'll never be able to speak it. Most people, 99% of the people, you'll never be able to pick up the language if it's not your if it's not your native language. The best you'll get is near native. I'll tell you that. After 70 years, I could never speak like a native, but I could almost be almost like a native, near native. Okay, and there are ways around that. Okay, because Russians could detect slight things in my accent that I can't fix. Well, after 7 years old, I was born in this country, speaking English. Right? After 7 years old, the muscles in your throat, in your larynx, and so forth, that form the vowels and consonants that we have in English are fixed. Those are fixed. Well, same thing in Russian. It's a Slavic language, and it is different. Okay, very different. But that's, it's nothing to get scared about because you can learn it. Point being is, you can tell the difference. They're Russian native can just detect the difference. So they always ask, who do you make production? By the way, where the heck are you from? And they'll just tell them, I am wherever you're not. So if they were the Moscow or St. Petersburg area, I was from the Far East. Oh, okay. Oh, got it. I got it. Oh, okay. And so forth. Okay. And that really happens. Now, what you can do, though, is translators. Okay. If there's something you want your character to say, write it out. All right. And then get various translations of that same sentence. Okay. Various. In other words, you get 10 translators in a room, you're going to get 11 different answers. That's just the way it is. Why? Because context. Okay, everything is dependent on context. And so what you can do is you get a sense of what you want that character to say in their native language by looking at various translations of that same passage. So you can get around that. Okay, that can happen. But you really do have to be very careful about colloquialism. Make sure that they are in the correct language, correct dialect for the area that you're in. Okay, Moscow and Petersburg both have different dialects. Oh, by the way, they have which one would they use? All right, but you can figure that out. You can do that with some degree of accuracy. And there are ways, like I said, get various translations of the same sentence. Okay, now, in fact, there's a thing in here I've added in the back because Russian, guess what? It's not fun. It is. I taught Russian at the academy, but I'll tell you, they don't have the same alphabet we do. No kidding. It's called Cyrillic. It's 9th century, and however, it is phonetic like Greek. That's what it's based on. So you only pronounce what you see. That's good, unlike French. And it can be learned. My class, they would be making sentences. They'd have the alphabet memorized by the first week, end of the first week, and making sentences. Can be done, sure. Okay. Now, what you can do is that you can make that part and parcel. It's like a dressing to a salad. It's not salad itself, but it does put the taste into the salad. And that's what when you use the modern language and colloquialisms and so forth in the native language for the speakers, it does make a difference. It does. It helps the reader be put into that situation. Okay? Now, in terms of reference, I created an appendix. Okay? Things that you need to know. All right? This will help you understand. Okay? Because I didn't dumb this down. All right? I did not dumb it down. The Russians use something, and they still to this day correlation of forces and means. Correlation of forces. Correlation of forces is the way they analyze a country's military and political potential. Okay? It's done by algorithms. Yes. They believe, still to this day, it's taught in the General Staff Academy, no kidding. Okay? It's taught there, and that they can figure out any situation by looking at certain indicators, digitizing those indicators, and come out with an action. For example, I took a class at George Washington when we were stationed back east in D.C. at George Washington on correlation of forces. And you were given a set of circumstances, in this case, two warring countries in the Middle East, and you, okay, had to determine which one was going to win, based on the correlation of forces. Now, but Dave, how can you digitize the undigitized? How can you quantify the unquantifiable, like morale, for example? Well, there are ways. What they do is they establish fields, okay, within that algorithm that have parameters, okay? And that's what they use. So they can't tell specifically, but they can give you a likelihood, okay? Now, and they're using correlation of forces to this day, okay? The main enemy, Glavny Protivnik, that's you and me. The U.S. is still referred to as the main enemy. How about, I've got the Moscow rules right here, so that you know them. For example, like assume nothing, never go against your gut. That is really important. I can't tell you how often that is. If it doesn't feel right, just doesn't feel right, get the hell out. Okay? Something wrong, okay. Everyone is potentially under opposition control. Do not look back. You are never completely alone. Okay? Go with the flow, blend in. Okay? Yep, blend in. Vary your pattern, stay within your cover. Lull them into a sense of complacency. Okay? You can take on a persona of being a tourist. Okay? And they'll just, well, they can't afford all this manpower against a tourist, right? So they'll start dropping off. And you'll notice that. Okay? Do not harass the opposition. Never take their picture. Never take their picture. Why? Because if you do that, you just killed their career. And they're going to be ticked. They're going to be very angry with you. And they're going to take it out on you. Okay? So don't do that. Remember, you're the mouse, and your country is a big mouse trap. Right? Okay? Pick the time and place for action. You must. Don't allow yourself to be placed in a situation where you're reacting. No. Now, keep your options open. Plan A, B, and C, and D. Okay? There has to be. Be fluid. You can't be so straitjacketed into a way of thinking and a way of doing things where you can be predictive. All right? Remember about the predictive? You don't want to be predictive. Okay, a zek. Who is a zek? Everybody's heard the gulag. What do they call the prisoners? Prisoners are called zeks. It's from a Russian acronym. And I go into it. It's called zakuchony, means imprisoned. Okay? That's what they're called. So I use that. Okay? Anecdote. Anecdote are Russian jokes. Now they have a different political sense of humor than we do. I can tell you it is different. Remember when I was telling you about the country is basically conformist. The party owns and will tell you everything you need to know. Well, some people don't like that. But there's nothing they can do about it. What they can do, however, is privately and personally make up these little, what they call anecdote. Anecdote are political jokes, political cultural jokes. And I included a couple in here. For example, between themselves. Okay? Between themselves. How do we know that Adam and Eve were Soviet citizens? They had one apple between the two of them, they had no clothes, and they believed they were living in paradise. Remember about how they take their little nick back into the culture of the history? That's how they do it. Okay. On a sunny morning, begins one late Soviet era joke. Anecdote, Brezhnev goes out on the balcony of his apartment. He looks to the east and says, "Hello, son." The son replies, "Good morning, dear Leonid Ilyich, the beloved leader of our glorious socialist motherland, the hope of all progressive humanity, and the guardian of peace on earth." In the evening, Brezhnev goes out on the balcony again, admires the beautiful sunset, and fishes for a compliment. "Hello again, son." The son answers, "I don't have to listen to you now. I'm in the West." And there are others as well. So, now, how do you know enough about your field to start writing? Confidence. There is no real way. You have to be confident about you know enough sufficiently that if you were a reader, immersed into that field, that you would feel comfortable explaining and feeling yourself in that same area. It's a confidence factor. It can't be taught. It is like I say here, it's a common dilemma. Okay. And finally, your torture has come to an end. Okay. There's that's my my website and my email address. That's my professional one. If you like, I can give you my personal one if you require, because I do have a blog, and there are two sources here that I really would stress that you use if you're considering historical fiction, and that is the Tips on Historical Fiction from Successful Novels and How to Write Historical Fiction in 10 Steps. It'll save you a lot of time. It'll save you an awful lot of time, and from making mistakes and writing an entire chapter and then say, "I really don't like this." And I've just spent a lot of time reading and researching, and I really wish I hadn't done that. I didn't want to go on in that direction. Okay, and don't worry, this has been rewritten 3 times. And the first time I wrote it was for a text book, and I finished it. I did all the research and support, had a big help, and I didn't like it. I just didn't like it. And Michael, my wife, we talked about this, and I said, what about turning it into a novel? You've already done all the work, make use of it as a debut author, use it as an historical fiction, with characters and so forth that will bring out the history also, as a byproduct. And so, yeah. And I've gotten good reviews. Everybody who read it said they like it. Now, could they be checkers telling me that? Well, it's from different sources. So, different sources have said that they liked it. And that they would wish I would pick up and do a sequel. And that's what I'm considering now, is a sequel. Because the characters are strong enough, I feel, that they can continue on. But ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude my winded talk. You've been very kind and very patient. Any questions? Yeah.
You mentioned the correlation of forces. I've heard of a mathematical political theory called reflexive control. Are you familiar with
I
it
am.
and how it works?
Yes. In fact, when I was working, something we had to be very concerned about was reflexive control. Because the Russians have spent a great deal of time, energy, and research doing reflexive control. Reflexive control is where you set up situations where your adversary has a limited number of options that you have put in place. Okay? In other words, you actually become, your actions as a nation or as a person can become predictive. Okay? And that is not a good thing when it comes to national policy and so forth. They can point you, that is, if they're doing it right, because they'll use a various number of things. There's the press, for example, there's military exercises. There's a number of ways that they can do that to get you reflexively controlled. And then I'm going to get into conditioning, because that's part of it. And you will react, because why? Because they understand your political culture. For example, they understand our method of government more than we do. They know that our senators and so forth, a lot of them are beholden to their constituencies about the pork barrel that they can bring into their state. Russians can stress that. This is what we can do for you, okay? We can help you get reelected. Well, that's also into your best interest. That is reflexive control. Okay, conditioning. You all familiar with the frog in the water? Okay, you change the temperature gradually until it boils, but the frog never accepts that he's being boiled. That's conditioning. Well, we can be conditioned too. For example, in 1982, Poland was becoming, well, very restive Soviet Socialist Republic, okay, under a guy by the name of Lech Walesa. Now, what he did was he created his own union, not a Soviet-approved one, called Solidarity. Okay? Okay? Now, we knew that the Soviets were going to react and were not going to accept this kindly. Why? Because it went against course and grain of Soviet thinking. That is, it was independent, and it was not going to be submitted to party control. That was verboten. They could not allow that. Solidarity could not allow it to be continued, or it was going to be like East Germany in 1953, or the Czech invasion in 1968. That is the socialist invasion of their brotherhood, called Brezhnev Doctrine. We anticipated that the Soviets would send forces in, to squash the Solidarity movement with Lech Walesa. Well, what they did was they would put on alert certain units, okay? And we would think, I can remember Europe now, this is it, they're coming, then they would stand down. Okay? 2 weeks later, they would do it again. Different units at a higher level. Okay? This is it, they're coming. That means you send reports out to Washington, D.C. and so forth. Everybody gets ramped up. All right? Well, they kept doing that, but they never did invade. That was conditioning. It's the same thing now with North Korea. You realize at one time or another, at the DMZ, the military zone, North Korean forces were not down at the DMZ, but gradually, conditioning. They moved their forces down there, so until one morning we woke up, the DMZ, North Korean army, was fully empowered, in place, and could invade South Korea at a moment's notice, right there at the DMZ. And suddenly they were just there. Where did they come to? Well, they conditioned us to accept what little forces at time in dribbles were coming down there. And suddenly we woke up one morning and the DMZ was now populated by the North Korean army. All right? Now, I can tell you from working, we call this, it's called Bieli Shu. That's what the Russians call it. It's called white noise. If, for example, you're in West Germany and one of you're working on a headset and your idea is to listen to Soviet communications and units and so forth, military communications, okay? What they can do is, little by little, introduce jamming, except it's very subtle. Bieli Shu, white noise. And you think, well, maybe if I just tweak it a little bit. No, it doesn't. Well, then it must be the atmospherics, something. No, you're being jammed. And gradually, little by little, they'll keep tweaking it until the information that you get is worthless, because it's all background noise. Well, that background noise is white noise, and it's intentional. You were being jammed. Little by little, you didn't know it, but you were being jammed. And they actually just would shut you down. In other words, your mission about listening in on Soviet military communications, worthless. Okay? Why? Because you couldn't get anything. Your atmospherics was intentional. It wasn't atmospherics at all. It was Russian jamming. Okay? So, that's 1983. A lot happened. Ed?
I got a question. Do they still subscribe to the bad theory, mutually assured destruction?
Oh, yes.
Is that still in place with?
Yes, to a certain extent.
And I remember when I was a child doing duck and cover drills.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And it was kind of taken for granted that we were gonna eventually destroy each other.
That was, you know, and this, I get into it a little bit here. Now, remember I mentioned about the immersion? That was my job, was to get into how the Soviets thought and so forth.
And you mentioned the gaps too, like, made me think of, the movie, with the mine shaft gaps.
Oh, Dr. Strangelove.
Dr. Strangelove.
That's one of our top 5 movies of all time.
Oh, I love it.
Oh, yeah. I had the script. When I was retired, they gave me the script. When I was up at the academy, if in language class, if we got ahead of the teaching schedule, okay, we had some time. I turned on Strangelove. Oh, yeah. You can't watch it enough times. Kubrick was fantastic. Every time I see it, there's something new that I've seen before. But of course.
One of my favorite lines in that is where he says, "No fighting in the war room."
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here, this is the war.
This is the world. Oh, yeah. And
That's one
now
of my favorite
Dimitri.
movies too.
You must understand he is, of course, a man of the people. Yeah. There's lines in there that are just fantastic.
Did you put any of that in the book?
No, I didn't. However,
There's just so many lines in there that are.
oh yeah, there are.
Reminds me so
Yeah.
much, like I said, of the duck and cover drill.
Oh yeah. Now, I do bring up one point. You know, I told you about getting into the Soviet, how they think, their mindset, okay? After Cuba, the Soviets realized that they realized how vulnerable they were, because here they were, and they had, 2 fleets. The country went to DEFCON 2. They were, thousands of bombers in Florida willing to bring them down. They couldn't do anything about it. They could not change the correlation of forces. Totally against them. They would have lose, okay? So they pulled back. Of course they did. They pulled back. They would have lost. And the Soviet Union would have been destroyed, because there wasn't any bomber gap. And if there was any bomber gap, it was in our favor, Okay. Now, Brezhnev, when he toppled Khrushchev in 64, October of 64, said that that was not going to happen again. They were going to bring the Soviet Union to parity with the United States in the number of ICBMs, and they did. They bankrupted the entire economy. Stalin was referred to as cult Lichnosti, as the cult of personality. Okay? He didn't. Okay. Brezhnev was known as the cult Zastoya, the cult of stagnation. Killed the economy. Okay. The Soviet worker now felt totally helpless because they saw no progress. So all the money was going into the missiles. Everything was going into the military, the metal eaters. Okay. Well, they did. They achieved parity. They reached the same number of ICBMs that we did. Well, Reagan said, no. They're going for superiority. That's another argument. But point was, what people fail to recognize is something very important from the Soviet perspective. Okay? We've been brought up on deterrence. You talked about MAD, mutual assured destruction, which worked. Okay, you destroy me, I can destroy you even more. Okay, it worked. Well, we're still here. The point was, how would we deter the Soviet Union? Well, that's what we did. Triad, right? Bombers, missiles, and submarines. Okay? If 2 are taken out, the 3rd can still destroy the Soviet Union. Okay? Fine. No one ever asked, how would the Soviet Union deter the United States? Remember, you're the enemy. Okay? By virtue of your capitalism, okay? You're bent to destroy my country. How do I deter you? They never asked us that question.
Because you were within the IC at the time, right?
Yes.
And so you didn't see people attempting to think from the perspective of the Soviets?
Yeah.
Really?
When I would be briefing, and time again, we don't want to hear what the Soviets are thinking. It's what we think that's most important. I've heard that so many times. And what kind of apologist are you for the Soviets? Got that too.
Wow.
Yeah. No, they didn't want that. They didn't. You're talking about people, kinetic. Kinetic. Kill them. That's how you stop them. You kill them. Okay? Well, no, there are other ways. You don't have to kill them. Okay? That's what got us into this position to begin with. You don't have any options. But look at it from their perspective, No, by the way, this is something that they did not want to hear. Okay? And I bring it up. I do bring it up because it was one of my pet peeves of all time. And that is in Soviet military doctrine, you've got to know their doctrine. Inside that, you've got to know their doctrine because that's how they think. It is their Bible. Okay? Once you become familiar with that, you can pretty much determine how they're going to respond. Okay. Buried in that doctrine, still to this day, is preemption. Preemption. Okay? I'm going to read you something from the back of the book. Preemption first. In 1983, the Soviet military conducted its own exercise, because we had our own exercise, Zapad 83, Zapad means West, which prepared for the first time since the Second World War for a situation where our armed forces, Soviet armed forces, obtained reliable data of an adversary, decision made by highest military and political leadership to launch a surprise attack. Capitalism would do that. You've already done that. You've showed us how you're going to do that. Using all possible firepower, artillery, aviation, etc., against us. In response, we conducted offensive operations to disrupt the enemy attack and defeat its troops. That is a preemptive strike. One of their indicators, by the way, of impending attack is they would count the number of lights on the Pentagon. They would look for indicators like blood drives or the cost of meat, things that would be touched upon if there was a conflict. That's the things that they would watch for. Remember, 28 million, more than 28 million died. Not again. This time they're not going to sit back and wait for you to attack. It was best explained to me in East Germany at a function. And I met a Soviet colonel. He was an airborne colonel. And he explained to me, and he says, David, think like this. We're like two boxers in the same ring. Why shall I allow you to throw the first knockout punch? I'm not going to have that many casualties again. And the best way to do that is hit you first. Yes. And it is in their doctrine, and it is there, and it's still there. So you push a Soviet bear too far, too hard, Russian bear, and he'll come out fighting. He will fight. He'll fight first. Let's see. Oh yes, one of my favorite ones. You don't know how close war is. From the Soviet. And then remember, they had the idea of preemption. And that's what 1983 does. It takes you from 1979, end of 79, when they invaded Afghanistan, and NATO decided that we would counter the SS-20, which was their missile, with cruise missiles and Pershing IIs, which, oh, by the way, was extremely accurate. In other words, if you take out their command and control, they couldn't do it. But they could do it. They could kill all of Western Europe.
We still have the SRAMs?
I'm sorry, sir?
You still have the SRAMs?
We don't know. No,
Because we did for a while.
We did. SRAMs are SRAMs, short-range attack missiles. They were hung on B-52s. 52s. Yeah. And the way that's how the B-52 would ingress into Soviet Union was that they would use these SRAMs, and SRAMs were guided missiles that would take out AAA, SAMs, and so forth as they ingress.
I think they could put nukes on them too.
Yeah. We don't do that anymore.
we had those
No,
issues.
no. But, if you look at Soviet maps and so forth about what NATO is, you see them totally surrounded. They had no allies that they could rely on. Chinese were against them at this time too. They fought the Chinese on the, in the Far East over border controls. And, so they had no friends there. And down south, they had radical Muslims on their border, and an undefended border at that, because NATO wasn't there. But and of course, west, NATO, and there's something about, they detest NATO. The current president of NATO once asked what he could do, in a conversation with Putin in Moscow, he asked, what can NATO do for you? And he said, leave. Of course. NATO's mission, very succinct, okay? Very succinct. It is keep Russia in Russia.
Wasn't one of the Russian demands before the most recent invasion of Ukraine that NATO membership would revert to 1991 status, something like that?
There's something here, and I've had our allies ask us about this too. One of the reasons, the quid pro quo about the Russians leaving East Germany, okay? East Germany, was that NATO would not move forward. In fact, I was asked, okay? I was asked by a Soviet, because I had to work in a relationship with my counterpart. I never lied to him, and he trusted me. And he said, David, will NATO move forward when we leave out of East Germany? Will they move into East Germany? So I went back to Europe, got an answer, okay? The answer was no. Now, when the Soviet Union imploded, one of the guarantees that Gorbachev wanted was that we would not take advantage of the Soviet Union imploding and the Warsaw Pact disappearing. Well, first thing that happened was countries that had been occupied by the Soviets, not liberated, occupied, Poland and the Baltic. First thing they did was they wanted to be joined in NATO. NATO expanded. And then we started putting troops on a rotating basis. They weren't there permanently, they weren't in permanent concerns, but they rotated in and out. And then, the way it was explained was, you Americans, you lied. You lied. You said you weren't going to move forward. NATO was not going to expand. Putin to this day holds our feet to that fire. That, you lied to us. Was that you Americans, you're like a fireman. You see a place where a building might catch a fire, so you send firemen. Well, those firemen need support, so you get a tanker truck for them, but they also need different kinds of support because it could be a different kinds of fire. So from the idea that there may be a fire, you now have a fire department. That's NATO. That's NATO. So that is a very touchy point. I've actually gone back and looked at the language that we signed off on, got them to sign off on, and it never explicitly says that NATO would not move forward. It's the understanding. We led them to believe that we would not. So it was an understanding, and that's the best I could come up with. Because too many times I was asking myself, are they right? Are they right? Well, in their understanding, yeah, they're right. NATO did move forward despite what we said, despite what we led them to believe. Okay? Now, some of it was out of our hands. Like I said about the Poles and the Baltics. NATO's policy was never to turn a nation away that voluntarily wanted to join. Okay? It just happened to be former Warsaw Pact countries, and that buffer, that's what Warsaw Pact was a buffer, was now NATO. Their worst enemy. Anything else? Okay.
I'm gonna clap again.
All right, yeah,
That was
thank you so
so
much.
wonderful. Thank you.
You're very well, you've been very kind, you've been very kind.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.